welcome to the Brazil Forum UK 2020. I'm Fabrizia de Marco, Master's Degree International Migrations and Public Policies at the London School of Economics, and I'll be with you today at the panel, What's Next Brazil? And this event and the others are being held thanks to the team of volunteers that form our organizing committee, the support of sponsors, Haddad Foundation, Lema Foundation, Idea Big Data, and the law firms PGMBM and Matos Filho, and also our broadcasting partner, Estadão, who enables us to broadcast the event to the entire world live and for free through our social networks. The Brazilian external foreign policy is one of the areas with greatest prestige in the national public policy. Over the last decades, the significance of the country in the international scenario has led it to host mega events, coordinate the peace mission of the United Nations, and highlight as a very important player in the global South region of international cooperation. Moreover, it has been the main speaker since 1947, the first speaker since 1947 of the Ordinary Assembly of the United Nations. But we have had a rupture most recently with a greater formation of the United States and the involvement of governance of the member and in ideological clashes with China has led us to new paths in Brazilian foreign policy. With the pandemic this year, Brazil still challenges very important things such as the construction of a negative image to the country and also other frontiers and restrictions to human mobility. In this context, we have put into debate new routes of Brazilian public policy and also the future of international relations in Brazil. And here to discuss, we have Monica Hirst, who is professor at the Universidade Torquato di Tella in Argentina, Adriana Erthal, who is a specialist in international relations and co-founder of the platform Cipó, and who also has an important role in the construction of climatic peace and governance internationally in Latin America and the Caribbean, and Paulo Nogueira Batista Jr., who is an economist and was the director of the International Monetary Fund between 2007 and 2015, and vice president of the new development of BRICS. We would have the participation of anthropologist Rosana Machado, but unfortunately she wasn't able to be with us today. And despite that, we will continue with the contributions which are equally relevant of other debaters. Well, let's begin our debate then. Monica, the Brazilian foreign policy is deeply rooted in Brazilian society. To approach this discussion with our public, please explain to us in a simple manner what is Itamaraty's tradition, which historically has given much more forefront to multilateral organisms, and compare it with the new contours of foreign policy, especially in the current Bolsonaro administration. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the invitation to be here today of the Brazil Forum UK 2020. I believe we have a connection problem with Monica. Let's wait a minute, please. So, we're waiting for the connection problem to be solved. Monica? Yes, well, I think I'm going to switch to my mobile signal to be able to participate. Maybe we have a certain kind of connection problem and an unforeseen problem. I like to continue to give my answer. Yes, you can continue. Okay, we're hearing you now. Okay. Well, the tradition of Brazil's foreign policy in terms of its continuity, in terms of norms, content, undoubtedly you have placed it, you have stated it very well in terms of our multilateral approach we have had in our tradition since the last century. The main concern with an important and a strong presence, a concern of our foreign policy with the consolidation of Itamaraty, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with an agenda that has put forward this agenda, this approach. I would say that one of the points of demolition, I would say, it is not possible to translate. I'm sorry, the connection is is very unstable. Okay, Monica. I'd like to ask Paulo. Paulo, we have seen recently that pertinent topics regarding foreign policies have echoed in an anti-globalism and a Bolsonarism discourse and manifestations of racism and anti-communism, but China has been for many years the main commercial partner of Brazil and also a large investor in our country. In your perspective, what are the immediate economic and long-term consequences of the Brazilian government clash with China? Well, Fabrizia, first, can you hear me, Fabrizia? There's an interference. No, I can hear you well. Okay, so first, although I'm very critical to Bolsonaro's government's foreign policy, I understand anti-globalism because since the 90s at least, the so-called ideology of globalization has been prejudicial to countries such as Brazil, emerging countries, let's put it this way. So I even wrote about this in the 19s in several of my papers, warning Brazilians of this anti-globalist discourse, and Bolsonaro has decided to denounce it. Up to now, okay, we're on the same page, but it's not easy for me to understand the rationale of being hostile toward China. That's a type of an amateur delirium of the Brazilian foreign policy, because as you said, China is our main commercial partner since 2009, I'm sorry. We have a long-term standing relationship with China within the BRICS group, which I have participated in since the beginning, and we have many reasons to have a cordial relationship with China. So it's even kind of idiotic be hostile toward China. I'm not saying that Brazil has to accept everything. Of course not. We have our own interest. China has its. Of course not. We shouldn't align with China or any other country. Brazil is one of the largest countries in the world. It has to have remain on good terms with many important countries, including China. That is why it doesn't make sense at all for Brazil to gratuitously, for no reason at all, to enter into clash with China. I lived 2 years in China when I was the president of the new development of BRICS. I had long relationships with Chinese members, Chinese people, and they are very pragmatic. They are even pragmatic in a kind of savage way. So maybe they are even sorry that Brazil elected Bolsonaro, but they will never say that. And then they are going to try to deal with it. When Dilma left and we had Temer, they dealt with Temer. Now they're dealing with Bolsonaro. They have many interests here, of course. But the trust between Brazil and China has been shaken due to wrong declaration statements and Bolsonaro visiting Taiwan when he was a candidate, for example, in 2018. I think you can visit Taiwan. Brazil is free to do that, but you have to know why you're visiting Taiwan. You need a plan. You cannot visit Taiwan just because you want to. So without a more active participation in Brazil and also in this South-South cooperation. She is in mute, so I cannot translate her. Adriana, your microphone is in mute. Whoa, I'm sorry. Thank you. Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here with you. Congratulations to the students who have promoted and created this series of debates. Great to see Paulo and Monica again. Regarding the South-South cooperation, first we have to think where China was before the pandemic. We already have an expansion of the China influence with institutions that are part of the global governance, not only in the United Nations, but also parallel institutions that have been created, including the BRICS Bank, the Asian Bank of Investment and Infrastructure, that complements and sometimes create some tensions in the scenario. So China had a role that at the same time participated more actively in the system that was established after the World War II, and also pressure, a tension that was not revolutionary, but provoked certain discomfort and also some type of innovation also within the World Bank at the extension that it started accepting certain times of clashes and risks, which was more typical to China. With the pandemic, I think China will use more spaces to expand its influence in recovering the pandemic, if we can call it a recovery. At the starting line, China seems to be in front. It has imposed very strict controls when the pandemic started, and has managed in a certain way to slow down this pandemic. Although it is facing several economic challenges, it has been showing signals that it will resume growth probably before United States and other countries. Of course, certain things will be important in the sense, such as stimuli aids being prepared by these other governments. But I think China is very well placed to occupy economic and political spaces that are being left aside by the United States because they have been looking just to themselves in the Trump government, which makes it difficult for the United States in the international scenario. So when we think about South-South cooperation, we have to understand these large changes in the global scenario to understand that when China launches this project of constructing the new Belt and Road, China, in a certain way, is creating new mechanisms of influence and through cooperation, actually. It's not something specific, bad, or innovating. The United States and Europe used to, or maybe still have alliances, transatlantic alliances that you can think of also a geopolitical, geoeconomical corridor that has provided, enabled several benefits to both sides of the Atlantic. But now, who is leading this is actually China. So now we see that several emerging countries that are at the heart of this project in terms of participation and joining the Belt and Road, they look at China to obtain cooperation and assistance. At the same time, China has increased its role with the United Nations, but not drastically, but much more gradually. And we see this reflexes of the geopolitical clashes, and the exclusion of Taiwan is a reflect of these clashes and the will of the Communist Party in China to establish a single China that's very important to China's foreign policy. And at the same time, we have Brazil, which has been decreasing, shrinking its vast portfolio of its South-South cooperation, which was technical, was problematic based on the corruption scandals we have seen involving the state-owned companies and also the contractors. But at the same time, and so that's something that has called my attention, Brazil has always been a protagonist in our region and its relation with several African countries in terms of technical and healthcare cooperations. The diplomacy of healthcare has a very long tradition, which comes even way before the cooperation agency. And Paulo Bus from Fiocruz has written up about that, and that used to be an asset in Brazil before the pandemic. If we had a government that was providing efforts to actually end the pandemic, it would be cooperating and offering aid to the South-South bloc cooperation, and maybe even in our Latin American neighbors. But now, regarding BRICS, the grouping has lost some space regarding the Belt and Road. I'm talking more about a platform of rules and actions. But it's very interesting when we think that not even the Temer government, which began a strong anti-BRICS government, or the Bolsonaro administration, completely abandoned BRICS. It's a speech that has a very strong speech based on the South-South cooperation, because you have investments, ideas of investments, political investments, financial investments that have been made throughout 10 years and that have enabled the establishment, for example, of the new BRICS Bank. So I think that the diplomatic body, even those that are not very fan of BRICS, they recognize that there are several opportunities in BRICS to play with local players which have a more important role. And even if Brazil also shrinks its participation in BRICS, which we have seen that has been happening, the agenda is very fragile in comparison to prior years. BRICS will continue to exist but BRICS today depends much more on China, Russia, and India than, unfortunately, the democratic BRICS, which are Brazil and South Africa. So it's a sui generis grouping which will continue to exist, but within a with a dynamic and uncertain scenario where we'll have see the predominance of United States China clashes with strong operation actuation of
That's okay.
France
Thank
and
you very
Germany.
much. We recovered the connection with Professor Monica, but I'd like to take this issue when talking about BRICS and ask the next question to Paulo. Paulo, Brazil actively participated in efforts in order to reform the financial architecture in the world before other emerging countries. A new development bank, known as the BRICS Bank, with the automatic alignment to the US. Would Brazil be defending the old economic order that privileges the global north? And with that, it would go on the contrary of its own interests. Well, the supplemental issue, I wrote a book on that. I published it late last year. I'd like to mention that again, which has to do with the efforts of Brazil in participating in a change in in international financial architecture, an effort that started around 2008. And within that effort, Brazil cooperated a lot with other emerging countries, especially the BRICS. There were two phases, Fabrizio. The first one was when the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa worked within the Monetary Fund, the G20, the World Bank, in order to try and reform the existing institutions. We made a good faith effort and we got something. I participated in the very beginning, but as of 2011, 2010, 2011 was very clear the position of the Americans and the Europeans in changing the existing entities was very limited. So the BRICS, without opening a confrontation, that was never their purpose. They continued working in Washington, but decided to create their own mechanism, not just the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, which was one of the founders, but also the monetary fund of the BRICS, which is called the Reserve Contingency Arrangement. But as Adriana just mentioned, the BRICS actually lost the leverage because not trying to defend ourselves, but defending a little. I'll bear you my testimony. Brazil was the engine of the BRICS during the initial phase. Russia launched the initiative. It started with Russia, but Brazil was either the engine or one of the engines up to 2014, 2015, when it starts the Brazilian political crisis and Brazil gets weaker. And the lack of Brazil's engine is felt in the fact that Brazil chaired the BRICS in 2019, and it was mediocre, really out. They indicated the new development of the BRICS Bank as of 1st July, a few days ago, his mandate started. They indicated an unknown name. I hope I'm wrong, but a name with a very little relevant curriculum. So Brazil is not playing a role in the BRICS process. So another thing I'd like to mention, which has not been mentioned, is there is a very serious conflict between India and China, which got worse in 2020. And obviously, if two large members of the BRICS have a conflict, even armored conflict with death on the border, that affects the mobilization power of the group. But just to finish this answer, which is too long, nothing of that justifies Brazil being what it is. It's not long, you may go on. But nothing justifies that Brazil being what it is will align automatically to the US. To no one, actually. Brazil is large enough not to need to align to anybody. Our relation with the US has to be a positive relation because we don't have any hostility in relation to the US. We must be careful with the relation with them because they are a little invasive, as we know. But we have common interest with the Americans, so it makes no sense for us to have an anti-American line. But it doesn't mean that by not rejecting it, we will align automatically. That's exactly what this government is doing. That affects our foreign policy as a whole, the way I see it. Because Brazil, when I was there in Washington and then in Shanghai, Brazil was seen, especially when I was in Washington, Brazil was seen as an independent voice. When Brazil spoke, when the IMF, United Nations, people would stop to listen to. Why? Because Brazil was seen as an autonomous factor. Other countries, which will not mention the name, not to be rude, were discounted when a representative from other country, from Latin America, wanted to talk. Nobody wanted to pay attention because they knew it was a subordinate voice. Unfortunately, Brazil, which is not like that, converted into that position, adopting a position of alignment with the US. So even in Temer government that started being seen, but in the Bolsonaro government even more, we have something which is absolutely ridiculous, which is Brazil sometimes, as you suggested in a question, contradicting even its own interests in bilateral concessions, trying and be closer to the US. The very Americans think it's weird. And just to finish, the way I see that in my time in Washington, in IMF and G20, how can I say it? The indifference and even the despise the way the Americans would treat us. And now Brazil voluntarily is a satellite of the US. Americans don't even understand that. They don't understand a country the size of Brazil is voluntarily making unilateral concession without making a firm negotiation. So thank you very much, Paulo. Now I'd like to pass the floor to Professor Monica. We just mentioned the automatic alignment of Brazil with the US. In that sense, I'd like to ask you, Monica, in the special interview the former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso gave to Brazil Forum UK on 15 June. The former president commented the presidential election this year in the US will be very important for the future of Brazil. On what measurement the current automatic alignment with the US and the result of this election will end up isolating Brazil within the continent and taking the chance that the prior question had lots of connection with that. I would like you to feel free to comment on the prior question. Yes, I know. We are in the middle of the way I can see it here. It's either logic and not technology, but I will leave because maybe we'll get back to the liberalism as of the discussion of the relations with the US. Milo Fernandes had many lines that helped us. It was a philosophy of life. If you run, maybe the beast will take you. If you remain, it will eat you. So the situation of Brazil is a little like that. That is, if the current administration is reelected, as Paulo just stated very correctly, our credibility crisis tends to go deeper, even more. We, in fact, will become, from the point of view of our presence in the international community, an absolutely irrelevant actor, and even to be despised from the point of view of the positions we have assumed, which is a follow-up. We will keep following without asking anything in exchange. It's not even an alignment. Actually, it is a condition of surrender Brazil has right now. In the case of democratic victory, which is a possibility right now, sometimes it's not the case. But the situation of the positions of the voters in Brazil is changing, in the US is changing a lot. First, because of the pandemic, and then the mobilization that there was because of the police violence and obviously the racism. All that is generating a mobilization important of voters who will make lots of difference in the elections. And then in the case of a democratic victory, Brazil will be in a very bad position. This Brazil of now. As the topics we will have in the agenda, especially the topics related to the liberal agenda, the values which value certain issues such as the environment, human rights, topics on which we are very badly positioned right now. And that will obviously make the US look at us if Brazil continues being who it is being right now in foreign policies with a huge despise. And clearly, we'll try and find other possibilities of bilateral relations in the region where there is a convergence of those political values. Brazil, from a point of view of a North American agenda, from an external agenda, which also has to recover credibility if it's a democratic plan, Trump did many bad things in many topics, in many fronts of work of the international policy of the US. Nowadays, there is a crisis caught right hand of liberalism and the multilateralism supporting in a liberal normatism. And you have a whole reconstruction area very important in the US from the point of view even of recovering a political space linked to what is so-called the variables of power. Joseph Nye, shortly during a conversation and in a paper, he mentioned the bilateral relations between US and China as of relationship, speaking from his point of view, but based on a framework of cooperativism and rivalry. But I ask myself, how will Brazil position as of this framework? How will this government work before a project of cooperation and rivalry and cooperation? I think there is even some difficulty to understand that concept. That's one our government would have to try and find out a way to be linked to it. Brazil wasted opportunities, political opportunities that were necessary in its relation with China. The relation with China, as it was said, it was historically advanced and expanding its agenda as of positive cooperation agendas, positive agendas of reciprocal interest. But now there is a political ideological blame on this position since 1974. How can we stop this ideology in the relationship with this government? I don't see any possibility. So I get back to Milo Fernandes. If we run away, the beast will catch us. If we remain, the beast will eat us. So our position is very bad. So Monica, thank you very much. We have just touched the multilateralism, and in that sense, I would like to ask Adriana. Adriana, we have seen at this moment a scaling up around the world of nationalism and a multilateral version. Brazil, which always tried to find a very active participation in international organizations, and even frequently played a permanent chair in the UN National Security Council. Now it has a different posture. What has exactly changed in the last few years on the work of Brazil in multilateral organizations? Thank you very much, Fabrizia. I guess it is a very important question, especially because this year is the 75 years anniversary of the United Nations, and there is a series of discussions being carried out all over the world about how to improve the effectiveness of the system. As I cannot see this discussion here in Brazil, and I think it is essential. Not just because Brazil, we have to bear in mind Brazil is the founder member of the United Nations. It was present, attended to San Francisco conference, and it embedded the innovations. Berta Lutz, which was one of the representatives of Brazil, thanks to Berta Lutz and three other Latin American women, the United Nations letter, for example, makes reference to women. Without them, the issue of gender would not have advanced so much, probably. So Brazil was always very active within the United Nations since the very beginning. And even going back to the United Nations League, the multilateralism was always a core in the foreign affairs policy, but more widely of international insertion that goes far beyond the foreign affairs ministry, which involves many other actors, not just the ministries, but also private sector, civil society. So very much you think about insertion and international affairs more than foreign policy. And at the same time, Brazil became very participative, very active, very proactive in basically everything the UN was doing. The three pillars peace, security, Brazil was fundamental in the last few years for this normative discussions about trend, for example, qualifying the discussion about responsibility to protect with the idea of responsibility when to protect, even if there hasn't been the proper uh, support discussions which are in the core of the work of the organization which are most influent in the United Nations. Even if we're being waiting for some substantial reform of process of the Security Council. I guess Brazil has never been within the United Nations someone who will follow the others. Brazil has always held postures that were different from what Paulo and Monica just mentioned about the current government, which was very different. In many occasions, Brazil was not exactly a spoiler because a spoiler we use this expression in order to denominate a country which wants to stop negotiations. But Brazil had positionings that were very different, usually based on not just a diplomatic tradition, but a very sophisticated line of thinking. For example, the negotiation of the countries agreement, Brazil has never expected automatically the positioning of the richer countries. It would place some objections, then would negotiate with a certain political ballast, which was recurrent in all this accumulated capital over many decades with a highly professional diplomacy. And then many examples. I think it is very interesting. An example I like to point out today is that Brazil, as Monica pointed out, would send troops, but would also, sorry, I guess it was Fabrizio who mentioned that at the very beginning, would take the role of leadership, especially in the military components of the peace missions. And very curious for me because many of those generals who currently are in high offices in Bolsonaro government, they were willing, they are willing to cast away all that legacy, which was a source of pride for the Brazilian militaries in order to join to this speech, the chair, the president, and the chancellor, that the UN is a global Marxist conspiracy. So what do we have? I guess in the last few years, something that happened during Temer government, a conservative government, but we just levered up, not into the direction of different ideas. We're levered up into an idea, into a direction of not having ideas. It's not a propositive foreign policy in any extent, especially in this kind of multilateralism that is established. We have a Brazil, even if there has never announced it has officially left the Paris Pact, but in practice we have. What we have seen happening in the Amazon since last year, and even under the command of the militaries in the Amazon task force, it is obvious the signal that Brazil is not currently paying attention or taking it seriously, its commitments, its environmental commitments in relation to climate. Brazil is now a spoiler together with other countries such as US and Hungary and great allies, a global role in a global pact on migration. So we have a very common reaction between diplomats of other countries currently, which is what happened. This is something very common.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you very much, Adriana. Our last block of questions actually are questions we like to make. One question to the three of you. So please, the order of answers should be Paulo, Monica, and Adriana, please. And please conclude them briefly. So, first of all, what is the future of the world order after the pandemic? Will there be a shift of power to non Western countries, or is it too early to evaluate this? Paulo, please. Well, I don't know if the order, I would say disorder more than order, but the balance of power internationally before the pandemic, and the pandemic has accelerated this. We have seen that this shift of political economic power has gone to from the United States to China, from the Western to the Asian region. So it's a geopolitical movement that, of course, is a gradual change. It's not that the United States will lose its power immediately, of course not, such as the transition of power from England and France to the United States took 50 years, and likewise will be a gradual process. Of course, the United States are accelerating this because they elected a president that is completely unprepared, which is a Bolsonaro with atomic weapon. The United States is accelerating this process. Trump probably never read La Roche-Tuquot, who used to say that hypocrisy is an homage of vicious to virtue. And by abandoning hypocrisy, he fragiles, he makes it much more fragile. He weakens the soft power, which used to be a very important inherent power that the United States had, and that Trump has eroded a lot. One more reason for Brazil not to align automatically with the United States on a long term relationship, it seems to be the part that is going to lose. At least we should be kind of equidistant in this geopolitical shift. Thank you very much, Paulo. Now, please, Professor Monica. Well, I would say that following the same line that Paulo has said, has stated, the pandemic has accelerated a process that had already started and accelerated and made it more dramatic also. This rivalry, United States, China, it's not good. It's bad to health, literally. To world health, the health of international community, multilateralism. I think that on the first wave of the pandemic is coming to an end, we hope, but we don't have want a second wave of the pandemic to happen because it could even be worse depending on the experience of the Spanish flu. We don't want another Spanish flu in relation happening in COVID-19. So on the first wave, on the Spanish flu, we were able to overcome all the clashes, all the petty fights, and take opportunity of the crisis to improve things and not worsen things. Obviously, this makes the world leave the pandemic or end the pandemic with a bipolarism, because I don't think this binary United States China will lead, is going to lead on the short and medium term, will not lead to a new world order. But of course it will incide greatly on the dynamics and unbalances of a balance system, which is already precarious because it's constructed, the system of power balance is constructed based on very different power attributes. So because China's powers attributes are very different from Russia's power attributes, but Russia is very important in the sense because it's very traditional and classical, because it has lingering throughout history in terms of political power, economic power, its capacity of destroying the other. It was like this in the Second World War, the Cold War, and so on. But China's presence is very different in this sense. Its attributes of power is regarding the economy, technology, commerce. It's another cup of tea in terms of power. And a cup of tea that, in this sense, I think it's interesting to talk to Paulo, because when he says we had a continuity of two hegemonies and now they are coming to an end. The first one came to an end a long time ago, and the second one, which is the United States hegemony, is in a process of eroding. So what we are seeing coming is not a new hegemony. So I think it's a very interesting discussion, which is how are we going to define this projection of power of China in the international system? And up to what extent will it be an effort, and how to what extent does China have a hegemonic process and hegemonic ideas in terms of ideology, politics? Not really. This projection of economic values, economic politics, is that the project of power of China? Not really, even because of its intelligence and its capacity, its pragmatic capacity of power. Okay, Monica, thank you very much. Now, please, Adriana. Well, thank you. I, in general, agree with this panorama. Usually, we used to say asymmetric multipolarism, but I think we're seeing the emergency of a dichotomy that is highly unstable between both poles. But I do not discard the possibility of a conflict that could arise of a more localized incident and acquire, as I mentioned, that is greater, to the extent that we have seen that this political, economic, geopolitical rivalry is acquiring a cultural, also a cultural front. So maybe not at right now, but unfortunately, I do not discard this. But I would like to highlight three things. The first thing is that the pandemic is increasing the gap between rich and poor countries. So we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean to the international world order? We already had huge gaps with the pandemics before the pandemics. Now we might even have more challenges in the political scope. Moreover, what is the role of Nations, especially seeing the impacts of the climate changes? It's terrible to think that pandemic is a type of essay to what is to come, but the estimates, the scientific projections have shown us, even for example, during my life and of my children's lives, we will be the testimonies, the witnesses of shocking things, of huge catastrophes. And how can we adjust the United Nations in this scenario? And in our region, more specifically, we face a large spectrum of organizations that are zombies. Of course, we have very important bodies and agencies in the region, but they have weakened and they are paralyzed. Even Brazil, it has always had a leadership in the sense, but albeit contested leadership, but now they have become zombie agencies. They have been paralyzed. And what do they represent in a scenario with so many catastrophes happening? So will the Belt and Road in this sense extend more toward Latin America? I'd rather ask questions than make conclusions regarding the shift of the international world order. Thank you, Adriana. Now, a last question for the three of you again. But our public is making questions, so I'd like to start with Paulo. Paulo, Luis Villar asks, regarding your first speech, isn't there a clear difference between the critics of the 1990s globalization, which was economic critics, and now a current critics, which is more related within the cultural scope? That is a good question, but there is a difference, but it's similar in the sense that the critics against globalization in the 19th, compared to today's critics, they tried to warn the public opinion of countries such as Brazil that it's important to preserve the national state, to strengthen the national state, the national culture. That's a fundamental topic that is depicted in a caricatural manner in our current government. So it's very strange to see certain theses that I have always seen as valid for Brazil being resumed in a very grotesque manner by this administration. But of course, we have to value Brazil, value our culture, our state, in face of the myths of globalism and globalization, which are very destructive of our capacity of actuation, of operation. Okay, thank you very much, Monica. Considering the new routes of the Brazilian foreign policy throughout these recent years and the critics we have been receiving because of its management of the pandemic crisis, what can Brazil do to recover its image as a significant player in the international scenario? Well, first of all, we know that my perception, at least, is that this recovery, it depends a lot on the development of the internal policies. So the possibility of Brazil resuming a view, a voice, a position in the international scene depends on political will. A political will obviously linked to a government, to a project of government, a project of international projection. So increasingly, I see that the political, internal political reality, domestic reality, it has always been like that, but increasingly there's predominance and dominance of the domestic agenda. And let's say that increasingly the foreign policy has increased its irrelevance. A few years ago, it had a certain position, but not even that now. So the pandemic, in this sense, has has worked in this sense because the pandemic it is a factor that has harmed and injured us a lot, killing every day a large number of Brazilians, unfortunately, but that has made us be very badly seen, and it's very shameful to have this image attached to us. At the same time, overcoming this reality is essential to construct brick by brick our image and national presence. The relationship with our neighbors will be very important. As Adriana well put, it's never been a regional leadership that was uncontested, true. But if Brazil is not humble to go hand by hand with its neighboring countries who have a lot of interest in having Brazil be more positioned with foreign policy that is more active, this region needs Brazil. The gap that Brazil is leaving South America is a disservice to the entire South America. So this, as Adriana said, zombie institutions. That what we're seeing now. It's not helping the region. The region is in a severe crisis regarding the impacts of the pandemics. Paulo knows this well, much better than I, but the economic impact that this pandemic is imposing on our region is huge. We have not had any type of interesting political operations and actions of Brazil in this sense in our region, or a voice constructed regarding the crisis in Venezuela, for example. It's another thing that Brazil has subjected itself to Washington. So Brazil has to resume, and we have to be humble and recognize the need of our actions within the region to be able to resume and to construct our image and role. Rubens Recupero used to say that it would take 50 years. I hope it's less, but it will take a while, and that we need to brick by brick show that we are able to go back to what we were someday and maybe become something else. That's a fact. Okay, Monica, thank you very much. Paulo raised his hand, but before he says what he would like to say, Adriana, please, now your answer to my question. I, thank you, Fabrizia. I agree with Monica. I don't expect anything from the current government, not even if Simonal was president. The militaries, they are completely willing to adhere to this paranoid approach and view, but that this government has. So we have to wait for the following the election to have a new government, a government without the military, with non-interventionism, pro-democracy, which is within our constitution and rooted in our constitution, and they're not being defended by the current policy, foreign policy. I think not only we have to resume our leadership regionally, albeit contested, we have to construct a critical relationship with strategic partners. And here I mean not only China, because China will remain its commercial relationship with Brazil, but we never seen such strong reactions, even in Brazil, based in Brazil, against the insults of the Bolsonaro family, but not only against China, but also Argentina, Germany, France, which are also very important partners we have, and the BRICS in general. So I think this diversification, as Paulo said, Brazil doesn't need to set the United States aside. Of course, the United States is important for our foreign policy, but to be subject to it, to be the servants of Washington, that is that will misplace us completely. I think we have to resume our cooperation, South-South cooperation, but not what it was before. I think when we have a new foreign policy, this will also be an opportunity to critically see some exaggerations we made in the past, expansions that were done without thinking of an adequate strategy, in my point of view. So I also think that Brazil has the vocation to innovate regarding sustainable development, inclusive sustainable development, for example, showing once again, as it did before, the positive impact against deforestation in the Amazon with international cooperation. And I think also participating once again in the normative debate, because we do have a highly professionalized body of diplomats with experience and capacity to influence in a proactive and constructive and interesting manner what great debates of current debates, even regarding these challenges that are being faced, certain as privacy versus new technologies, climate changes, automatization of work. And so I place my faith, I put my faith that within the state, within the government, not only Itamaraty, but in other ministers, in civil society, with several players in university also, for example, that are engaged in these challenges, and also the private sector. I think that together these players, these actors in a more interesting and a more propitious moment will resume to what was before, but also with new values, especially in this area of protection to the environment and fighting climate change. Thank you again, Adriano. Please, Paulo, if I would ask you to be brief in your intervention. No, not really, just to say that answering your answer to your question, it can be we have to change government. With this government, it's unfeasible for Brazil to be a relevant actor. Brazil is one of the greatest countries in the world in terms of economy, geography, and we cannot behave in the international scene as a mediocre player as it has been doing since 2019. I think that's the sentence to summarize. Okay, thank you. We're reaching the end of our panel. And at the end of each panel, Brazil Forum UK is showing a campaign of financing related to the debated topic. We invite all of you to see each one of these campaigns and contribute to this cause. All informations are detailed in our social networks. Today, we'd like to highlight the campaign that tries to combat COVID-19 in situations of vulnerability. As Adriana said in the panel, this campaign is a campaign to help Casa do Migrante, Campanha Missão da Paz. It has a very negative, the COVID-19 has a very negative impact on these populations, these vulnerable populations, to guarantee good conditions of hygiene and cleaning in Casa do Migrante, which is a shelter that is home to welcome 65 migrants of different nationalities. We are asking money for the Missão da Paz, And this money that is collected will be used to overcome these needs. If you want to help, please search us in the social networks, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or LinkedIn to help. Now we say goodbye and would like to thank very much each one of our guests for their contributions. Thank you, Adriana. Thank you, and congratulations. And also for having the sign language translation that is very special. Thank you, Monica. I'd like to thank you and praise what you do of fundraising for those that are in need in the because of the pandemic crisis. We are facing a very dramatic situation, and sometimes these donations, they really help because there are people that don't even know where to go. Migrations, refugees that left their countries, that don't know if they go back, where they go to. If there is there's already a nomad population, and that has increased due to the COVID, making the migration issue even more dramatic. So, congratulations on your efforts. That's true, Monica. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Paulo. I thank you and like to just congratulate you too, you guys, because Brazil is not strong in organization, but you have made a very careful you in terms of effort on organizing this event, and I'm very proud of seeing the youth, Brazilian youth, in organizing this debate. Thank you very much for contributing this dialogue, and also like to thank our team of volunteers of our organizing committee, and also Ana Carolina Revoeira, Gabriela Same, João Quintela, and Leonardo Souza, who participated in the organization of this panel specifically. Studio 42 across, does the interpretation of the event in English, Susana and Marlo for the interpretation in sign language, Estadão for the transmission, and most of all, you who have been with us so far. You can see this debate again in our site, brazilforum.org, and also in our social networks. Brazil Forum UK will be back on Wednesday at 5 p.m. Brazilian time and 9 p.m. UK time on a panel about justice. And we'll have Paula Nunes, Marcelo Godoy, Maria Teresa Julio Gomes. Thank you very much. See you then.